All right, let's get more on this with Norman O'Reilly. He's chair of the Department of Sports Administration at Ohio University's College of Business. Norman, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Michelle.
Norman, we are seeing Chinese companies buy up sports streaming rights at a huge rate, from Tencent's $700 million deal with the NBA to Le TV spending tens of millions on digital rights to English Premier League football and Wimbledon tennis. Why is there such a huge appetite for this?
Yeah, it's a trend that's happened not just in China, but all over the world. And there's two real driving factors. And one is with the streaming, as the report just talked about, moving away from traditional television. The control of content is really the secret to success of any sport property, any sport media organization, any network, whether they're online or more traditional. You've got to have control of that content. So they're locking it up long-term deals with significant investments in return to do that. You're seeing that in North America, in Europe, the Olympic Games, the big leagues here, as well as in China to do that. And the second piece, Chinese investors are also purchasing, as you know, some sport properties like the Ironman Corporation, for example. And if you actually own or have a part ownership in that property, you guarantee access to that content into the future as the whole platform of digital expands and grows.
All right, Norman, so content is king, but what kind of return on investment is expected here? And what is the business model? Is it all subscription? Is it advertising? A combination of the two?
Yeah, well, there's obviously various different models out there, and the traditional model of advertising only in the old traditional networks is really not working anymore. Those networks are struggling from a financial perspective. So the mixed model of subscription fees as well as some advertising is really the way, in the ESPN model, which you talked about earlier in the report, is really the way to go. And the subscription fees from the traditional cable in North America are shrinking, but are now being replaced by streaming fees, or a la carte as we call them, where people can select whether it's streaming or television, the specific networks or specific properties they want. And this goes back to our previous point, and we've done lots of research around this at the regional sport, national sport, and global sport level. It's really about those properties that have superpower content, as we call it. And that's Wimbledon, as you mentioned, the US Opens, Masters Golf, Olympic Games, FIFA World Cup, where millions, tens of millions, even billions of people are willing to pay to have access to those properties. And if you control that content, you can charge those fees, you can access it to it, and the technology is coming through streaming and digital to really allow the properties to control that. So that's really the business model. You need to have those subscription fees, and then once you have those eyeballs, the advertising dollars will come, you have both sources of revenue, and you can build a successful property. The other element to the business model, which is important in the cases where the Chinese investors or other investors around the world are purchasing ownership in these properties, you've seen cumulative annual growth rates of NBA clubs, NHL clubs, NFL clubs in North America, Premier League clubs in the 10% range, 8 to 12% over the last 15 or 20 years. So these are really good investments, outreaching inflation and outreaching a lot of the markets that are out there. So those pieces are both at play.
Well, Norman, it's very interesting in China because it's not just basketball and soccer, which already have a strong following in China. We're seeing tech companies working at developing new sports. Alibaba investing multi-millions of dollars to develop rugby in the country, which really doesn't have much of a presence so far, for exclusive broadcast streaming rights to the sport. Is the demand that robust to create new leagues, new sports, new interests, or the companies just being too optimistic?
No, absolutely. And we're seeing this with esports and even video gaming and creating all online, that people are purchasing rights to watch. You see the UFC and the pay-per-view model that they're doing that's very successful. WWE's going that way. You can see the sport networks looking at sports like triathlon or the Olympic Games. So as long as that content that you've got, whether it's gaming or virtual reality or real sport or rugby, a new sport, has got an audience that's willing to pay to follow it, and then it's got an audience that's attractive to advertisers. Now, the scale gets different as they get smaller, but then the rights fees also go smaller, and then business model can still work. But if you've got a content that's got that kind of attractiveness and it's got a devout following, and then advertisers and sponsors who want to reach those groups of people, it can work. And that's what the investors are speculating on. And rugby clearly has a global following, maybe not in China yet, but as the sport grows, goes into the Olympic Games, women's rugby is really growing and expanding in various parts of the world. It's a very attractive property. You can build a strong business model around that kind of sport property.
So Norman, what does all of this mean for the traditional broadcasters?
It's scary. It's scary for the whole industry overall. When we've seen, if you look at the music industry or you look at the home movie industry, who lost control of their content and lost huge amounts of revenues, and really music had to completely reinvent itself. You don't want that to happen. And so far, sport has been pretty good at maintaining, as the cords cut on the traditional cable model around the world, that they're replacing those revenues with streaming, with digital, with alternative approaches. You see the sport networks and the investors, both in China and around the world, getting very creative, looking for properties, controlling that content, so you have very, very specific access to it. So if you want access, you've got to pay. This has happened at the regional level and at the national level, both in terms of networks and their evolution and going to streaming channels, all with revenue still coming. So clearly the pie is under pressure, but so far the industry's been very, very good. And the one thing we're very lucky at in sport is people want to watch live sport. Wimbledon yesterday, people want to watch Roger Federer play live. They don't want to watch it 2 days later, which gives the sport industry a real advantage over a lot of other televised and digital properties.
Right, absolutely. It's got to be live. Thanks so much, Norman O'Reilly, Chair of the Department of Sports Administration.
My pleasure.
At Ohio University's College of Business. Thanks for joining us. All right.